So you're buying a new motherboard and you need to know if you can just swap all the parts from your current build into the new one. Or maybe you're starting from scratch and you're building your own PC. How do you know what parts are going to fit in this motherboard? Well, stay tuned because we're going to go over all of that and give you some tips and tricks on what to look for in this video today. So in terms of motherboard sizes, you've got mini ATX, micro ATX, ATX, and extended ATX. Now, how do you know what motherboard is going to fit in what size case? Well, generally, they'll have the motherboard size in the case title, but very oftenly, if you're looking at cases online, you'll see a diagram kind of like this here, and it'll show you exactly what motherboards will fit and about how much space that they should take up. Bonus tip, they usually have similar diagrams when it comes to graphics card sizes as well, so you can tell if that beefy 4090 is going to fit in that mini ITX case. It won't. I'm not going to let you get your hopes up. It's not going to fit. Now, bear in mind, you can always buy a smaller motherboard that is intended for your case. Generally, the only issue is if your motherboard's too big to fit, but they're backwards compatible, I guess you would say, that you could put a mini ITX in a full-size tower. It'll just look a little goofy, but it'll work great. Cool, so your motherboard's going to fit in your case. Now let's talk about what kind of CPU you can put into that motherboard. That's going to be determined by what socket type the chipset is in this motherboard. I generally build around my CPU and GPU whenever I'm making new builds, and the reason I do this is because if I find a CPU, we'll use an i7-10700 as an example for this, just for this video. That CPU is an LGA 1200 socket type. So then what you can do is go to Newegg, Amazon, whatever you're getting your parts from. You go there and you can search for motherboards that specifically by their chipset type. So now you know what CPU you're going to put into this build, and you can filter and find a motherboard that suits this CPU, as well as then looking for other components that you need. By the way, if CPU chipsets confuse you and you don't know how to read them, don't worry, you're not alone, and I'm going to be making a separate video to kind of explain all of that sometime soon, so stay tuned for that. So now we have a motherboard that fits in the case that we want, and we have a CPU for it as well. Next thing we're going to talk about is the RAM, alright? You need to make sure that it's the right RAM type, DDR3, DDR4, maybe you've got some DDR5. Generally, the standard is DDR4 for right now. DDR5 just came out. It's honestly a little bit overkill for gaming, so I don't imagine many people are using it for gaming unless they're, just really, really trying to drop a lot of money and squeeze every single frame out that they can. So whenever you're looking at it, I mean, most people these current days are getting 16 gigabytes of RAM, DDR4. You want to make sure that whatever frequency your RAM is, the motherboard can support. There is nothing more devastating than having like 3600 megahertz RAM, pop it into your motherboard, and then realizing that it only supports 2166 megahertz. Now you've got really nice RAM, but your motherboard can't support it. Now, when it comes to RAM channels, I would advise having 4 channels for your RAM, just because it makes upgrade proofing easier. You might never upgrade, maybe you do, who knows, but if you have 16 gigs of RAM and decide that you want to upgrade to 32 in the future, it's a lot more cost efficient to just get another 16 gig stick of RAM and pop that in than it is to buy 32 gigs of RAM and then figure out what you're doing with your 16 gigs that was in there initially. The next thing that you need to look for is how many data ports does it have. I'm talking NVMe slots, SATA slots, those things. You don't want to end up down the road learning that you only have one NVMe slot for an SSD. You had a 1 terabyte. You want to add more storage, but don't want to add a hard disk drive because, you got an SSD, so you're used to that speedy life now. So now in order to upgrade, you've got to get a 2 terabyte NVMe, reinstall Windows, no. Make sure you have another port, buy another 1 terabyte, slap it in there, now you've got 2 drives. It's also great for organizing. I have 3 separate drives and I use them for different things. Now they do also make solid state drives that are SATA powered and everything, but I just prefer the NVMe's because the read write speed is a little bit faster, the install is easier, you don't have to deal with any cables, you just snap, boom, done. So I would be on the lookout for more NVMe slots versus SATA slots, personally, but however you want to do it. Now, another thing is going to be your PCIe slots. Now, these are where you plug cards into. More specifically, your graphics card is going to be plugged into a PCIe by 16. They also have smaller PCIe by 4 slots. And usually, aside from the graphics card, the only other thing you're really going to use these PCIe slots if you're building a gaming rig is if you're adding in something like a Wi-Fi adapter or a Bluetooth adapter, maybe a sound card, maybe a capture card if this is a streaming PC and you're playing on console. But other than that, I mean, you can get Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, everything like that built into the motherboard. Or if it isn't built in, you can also get USB adapters as well. So really you only need to make sure that it's got the PCIe by 16, and I'd be surprised if there was a motherboard being sold without one in this day and age. Speaking of USB ports, how many do you need? And that really does depend on you. I mean, how many peripherals are you using? Are you just plugging in keyboard, mouse, and a headset that are all USB? Okay, cool, you need 3. That's about it. Maybe you want an extra one just in case you need to plug a flash drive in. Also bear in mind, a lot of cases have a couple USB ports on the front panel. So the least amount I've seen on any motherboard is about 4 USB. Then you add the 3 that are on the front panel, so you've got 7, which is generally enough for the average user. And if you only have 7 and decide that you need more, you can always get USB docking stations that you can plug into your PC. They're pretty cheap, they're very easy to install, so you can always add more USB ports later. Can't do that with a lot of other things on a motherboard, so USB ports really aren't super high on the priority list, in my opinion. Alright, now one port that does matter a lot is going to be your Ethernet port. But you didn't know this, but they come in varying speeds. Just because you get a gig down doesn't mean you plug into the Ethernet port and you get a gig down on that PC. Not how it works. You have to make sure that it supports 1000 megabits per second down. The lowest I've seen is 100 megabits per second. I saw it because I got one. Didn't realize that it was 100 megabits per second LAN port, and I get 500 down here. So I was bottlenecked at 100 down, even though, you know, we're paying and getting 500. Don't be like me. Make sure you get the right LAN port. Now, in terms of display ports on a motherboard, this is really only a factor if you're using integrated graphics on a CPU, but it's pretty straightforward. Just to make sure that it has the right display port for whatever monitor you have, be it, you know, HDMI, Display 1, whatever. Now, that should pretty much cover the basics of everything that you need to look for in a motherboard. The only other thing I can think of that I forgot to mention when we were talking about CPUs is wherever the CPU socket is that it plugs in, generally the standard is an 8-pin connector. Some of them have an additional 4-pin or even an additional 8-pin. This is really only a problem if you're using very high-end CPUs that need that extra power draw. So, I mean, you can double check and make sure that you don't need the extra power. Generally, you'll be okay, but it's always better to, you know, measure twice, cut once. Just double check before you pull the trigger on buying that new motherboard. The only other thing to really keep in mind is going to be the brand of whatever component you're buying. This doesn't just go for motherboards, this goes for everything. And I'm going to be honest, I'm one of the most brand disloyal people ever. I'll just buy whatever the good deal is, and if it works, great. I don't really care for brands. Now, that said, something you do want to look into is like the return policy of these brands that you're buying, as well as what's the RMA, like what's the warranty, things like that. The only thing you're really getting with brands in terms of the PC world, in my opinion, is customer support. Do they have good customer support or do they not? That is the only thing that will generally make a brand lose me as a customer. Okay, so that should be a nice general, you know, overall what you should look for whenever you're buying a motherboard. I know there's definitely a couple things that I didn't cover. It's really hard to cover every single thing and answer every single person's question in a video like this. So if you have any questions that weren't answered in this video, make sure to drop them in the comments below. If I start getting a lot of the same question repetitively, don't worry about it. That just means I need to make a video that covers it. So thanks for helping me out if you leave your question. A good example of this is back in the RAM video that I did. If you haven't seen that, you should check it out. It answers a couple basic questions about, you know, RAM, what to look for when buying it. But one thing I didn't talk about is RAM timings. So I do know I need to go back, and honestly, the audio wasn't great in that video, so expect a re-upload of that video and probably a rework on a couple things as well. And be sure to jump into the Latency Discord. You can get hardware help there. You can get any kind of setup help, stream help. If you're streaming, a lot of us know a good bit about OBS settings, so you can get some answers there instead of just mindlessly talking into Google. You can actually talk to a person that, you know, knows what we're talking about. We also host a lot of tournaments in there, so I mean, even if you just want to watch, or if you want to jump in and show us your skills and whatever games that we have on your brand new rig that you've built. Now, my most favorite thing about the Latency Discord is I get to host a workshop every other Tuesday. So any Tuesday that a Tech Tuesday video goes up, just know that I'll be in that Discord around 6 p.m. Eastern time. And I'll be hosting a workshop to answer any questions that anyone might have, just open discussion on any tips you need for building PC. So jump in there, let me know how I can help, and hopefully I'll see you there. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.